We will now show the interview in which the Cuban dictator appears trying to explain himself as the noose tightens around the regime. Amid the crisis, international pressure, and the strain within the island itself, this comes at a time when many people see only two possible paths for the dictator: prison or the grave.
Mr. President, thank you very much for your time. We are meeting here in Havana at a very difficult time for your country. And before we start talking about the situation here in Cuba, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has spoken in the last few hours, and he has talked about Cuba. He says that after many, many decades, our time is coming. He keeps talking about taking Cuba. He keeps making threats against your government. I would just like you to respond to his most recent statements.
I believe that those of us who hold political office representing our people at the head of the nation, in a challenging world with so many problems, we should all foster friendly relations. That would truly guarantee the peace and security of each of our nations and each of our different regions. And also in the world, to move away from confrontation and wars, that we distance ourselves from conflicts with the forces that are always generated by multilateralism. And that as part of Christianity and the choice to pursue dialogue to resolve bilateral differences, we can solve multilateral problems or bilateral differences or multilateral problems in a definitive way. Anything different from that would be a shame. It would not be a contribution to the peaceful world we want to live in. The constant threats, the frequent rhetoric about aggression against our country by the government of the United States of America, the almost daily statements that are made as part of a human policy strategy and as part of psychological warfare, and also strategic with the main goal of frightening our nation and destabilizing our society. This is an outrage and an affront to the dignity of our people, as well as a blatant violation of international law. First of all, Cuba is a fully sovereign country. Cuba achieved its independence after more than 100 years of struggle, first against Spanish colonialism, and then, after the intervention of the United States, against the country's dependence on the US government as a neo-colony. We have embraced the cause and we are trying to build a model that is our own. We won't force this on anyone, but it's how we want to develop our country. We are a peaceful country. We do not pose a threat to anyone. We offer immense solidarity to all the peoples of the world. For this fundamental reason, Cuba is not just a nation. There is a conflict. We are not a colony. We will not give up our sovereignty or independence. These are principles that we must preserve and defend. Therefore, we firmly believe that there is some exaggeration. There is absolutely no moral or legal authority for any ruler of the United States to impose a policy that seeks to attack Cuba or take Cuba.
But do you believe they will use force and that an attack is imminent? Yes.
That would be speculation because there is a mix of political interests. The current administration of the United States is deeply committed to the Cuban mafia based in Miami and therefore is playing to its electoral base, and we are close to elections in the United States. And they are trying to cater to them to give a response to the desires and particular interests of those voters. So you have these political interests. On the other hand, there's a lot of excessive rhetoric and a lot of manipulation. And what is perfectly clear to us is that there is a real threat. I can't say whether they will do it or not. There's danger, and it's asymmetric. We have the United States playing the role of aggressor, and the United States is increasing its response to the danger and a possible intervention. And all of this puts us on alert. If by any chance there is an attack, the Cuban people will respond with unity, firmness, and always in defense of our national sovereignty. We do not wish for armed conflict in any way, but we are not afraid of it at all. We are fully prepared and vigilant to ensure that we are not surprised or defeated by anyone.
And we can talk about how you are preparing in a moment, but we have seen a military buildup on your coast. When Donald Trump threatened Venezuela, for example, he acted. When he threatened Iran, he acted. I know you're saying that when I ask if an attack is imminent, that's hypothetical. But we've seen in the past that when he said something, he did it. Are you taking seriously what he says when he claims he could take Cuba?
Well, those are the statements he made, and that's exactly how he usually presents himself to the public, or I mean the President of the United States. When the President of the United States or other spokespersons of this government maintain this position, for us, this clearly means that there is a warning sign, and we have the full responsibility to be completely prepared to avoid confrontation. The important thing here is that we need to avoid confrontation for the good of both our peoples. I think that the American people whom we respect and the Cuban people can have a wonderful relationship, like good neighbors, because we are very close to each other and we can share, as has been proven at other times when relations were in a more favorable situation. We can have many projects and businesses in common, as well as art, education, culture, and scientific research. There are so many areas of common interest that could be addressed together and also as peoples. We don't like to be compared with what happened in other places, because that would mean ignoring our history and not recognizing the strength of our institutions, the sense of unity of our people, and the feeling of valuing our sovereignty and independence. Thank you.
How do you say you are preparing militarily because you are taking this threat seriously? How are you preparing? And do you really think you can face the might of the United States Armed Forces, considering it's the most powerful army in the world?
Fidel taught us that there are no invincible enemies, and there may be very powerful armies, technologically speaking. There may even be armies that are extremely powerful in sheer numbers, but also in conflicts there are deep convictions and crucial decisions made by the people. In addition to all the sacrifices that people are truly willing to make for the continued defense of their sovereignty and national independence, and there is also the history and tradition of these people. There is a fundamental and very important hero of our wars of independence, Major General Antonio Maceo, the great leader of our independent army and the Liberation Army at the time when we were a Spanish colony. And he said the following: "Whoever tries to take the island of Cuba will only be able to take the dust of its soil soaked in blood." This is not just a slogan. It is a deep conviction that has been fully embraced by millions of Cubans, and there is...
Is that what you're saying to Donald Trump? Is that the message for Donald Trump?
Actually, I'm not interested in sending a message to the President of the United States. I'm just reflecting. I'm just referring to a series of issues that we're discussing, which are highly relevant right now and pose a serious danger to our country. I'm doing this to provide him with, to ask for permission and to express our opinions and convictions about these issues, and to demonstrate these points to the American public and the people of the United States, whom, as I mentioned earlier, we deeply respect and admire, especially because we are also convinced that the most important thing is to move away from confrontation. But I was pointing out that it's not just military power that should be taken into account. Military power in conflict, one army against another. But the decisions and choices of the people also matter. Throughout the entire history of humanity, there have been extremely powerful empires that eventually fell, even though they were supposedly much stronger, because there were other strategic actions taken by their adversaries. And I was mentioning a classic example like the case of the convictions in the history of Cuba, but there is a more recent example. Special Forces units of the American Army illegally kidnapped the president of Venezuela and his wife, and they forcibly removed them from Venezuelan territory to put them on trial, using the intention to criminally prosecute them in the United States as a pretext. There was a group of Cuban citizens who were part of President Maduro's personal security detail in Venezuela. Those Cubans, because of their strong convictions, fought bravely against the onslaught of those forces. And they were outnumbered and at a clear technological disadvantage. And they were also caught off guard by the unexpected attack. And a military operation that had been planned to last only a few minutes, to go in and extract the president, took much longer. 40-some minutes, and 32 Cubans gave their lives in that heroic action. Those 32 Cubans are matched by millions more here in Cuba. What would it mean for millions of Cubans to defend their independence and sovereignty, even when facing the most powerful army in the world? But looking at it from another angle, we are willing to defend ourselves. But I think the most constructive thing would be for us not to reach that point. This adventure will cost human lives, both for the American people and for the Cuban people.
You just gave the example of what happened in Venezuela. And the world saw and followed the way the military of Eswamiswan arrested Nicolas Maduro, took him and are keeping him in a prison in the United States. But aren't you worried that even though this operation, an operation you said should only take a few minutes, took 46 minutes, aren't you afraid that this could happen to you too? I mean, they indicted Raul Castro. For example, aren't you afraid that now you're in their sights? They're saying things like they want to arrest Raul Castro.
I've been asked that question many times, and the answer depends entirely on the attitude you have towards life's challenges and the complexities it presents. When you take on responsibility in a process like the Cuban Revolution, I was born in the early years of the revolution, and the revolution instilled in me a series of values and convictions. And I, like many other millions of Cubans, am willing to give my life for the revolution. And we are willing to fight until the last drop of blood, with the fundamental goal of defending our rights, our independence, our sovereignty, and all our historical achievements. When you take this firm stance in Cuba, you don't feel worried and you don't feel afraid. You carry a huge responsibility to avoid this critical situation, given our current leadership role in guiding this country's future. But worry and fear don't exist because we've already taken this stance based on our convictions in the face of a situation like this.
You are betting on the fact that the Cubans will rise up and defend their country if there is an aggression from the United States. The president of Syria is betting on the fact that if his government, his regime collapses, the Cuban people will rise up and take control of the country. How do you think this is going to end?
I really think that if we're saying we want to talk and we want to have a dialogue, that we want to find solutions, we want to find a solution that addresses our possibilities and our bilateral differences, why do we constantly have to keep bringing up these specific situations? Including in this, it's essential to put all these complex and delicate situations directly on that cross, saying it as if the government of the United States of America would actually do that. If the government of the United States were to actually attack, what do you intend to do immediately and effectively to respond? It would make much more sense if we analyze the consequences of these actions for society and for the future of diplomatic relations between the nations involved in this whole process of international relations, so that we can express this in an extremely simple and direct way. And the way to do exactly that would be by eliminating the problem. I would be reducing the problem to its simplest essence. Instead, I would like to ask the following question. What would be the motives and reasons for the United States government to consider attacking the island of Cuba, or to have the intention of taking control of Cuba? Based on what rights? Based on what excuse? What are the legal reasons for doing that? What are the reasons from a human point of view for doing that? Why does this have to be the obsession of the Zizewa government? Why doesn't the Zizewa government ask itself why we can't live as good neighbors? Why can't they recognize that we have political and ideological differences, just as they have with other countries around the world? And try to build a civilized relationship that allows us, despite our differences, to address other areas where we can. We must actively cooperate and create spaces that can effectively allow us to ensure national security. Both the United States and Cuba need to cooperate to preserve and strengthen security throughout the entire region. And furthermore, build trust that allows us to build a dialogue that moves us away from confrontation, which is what the people of Cuba and the United States deserve, a happy team. We are not saying how we are going to confront each other or what we need to be looking for, as if one is going to attack and the other is going to defend. What we should all be involved in is how we are going to resolve our differences and how we are going to create a space of understanding between us. What we have now is a President of the United States who also said that
During the past years, other presidents of the United States also faced similar situations. He tried to do something about Cuba, and now it's his turn. That's why I'm asking about the seriousness of this moment for you and for your country. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said, "We want to resolve this diplomatically, but we are dealing with your government, and your government doesn't believe that's possible." Rubio, dealing with your government, believes that then we can talk about what kind of deal you would like to put on the table if you would like to reach some kind of agreement with the Americans. So you don't end up in this situation where you feel threatened and as if you're dealing with some kind of confrontation. But the President of the United States also sent the head of the CIA to your country. What was the message he brought? Because he's talking about Cuba being a threat to national security.
I believe that the current representatives of the United States government have told many lies. They are blatant lies. They have manipulated international public opinion very intensely and constantly. First of all, a crucial moment in the worsening of this blockade until it reaches the point of maximum pressure, which is exactly what we are experiencing now. And taking into account all the major and serious problems this is causing in the difficult daily lives of Cubans, it has everything to do with the executive order from January 29th when they declared a total fuel blockade against our country, and they are actually condemning the entire country to try to live without any energy. This is a crime, this is genocide. Besides that, the official justification they use to approve this executive order is the claim. The President of the United States declared this himself, that Cuba represents an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. And although it's not your role because you're an interviewer, do you really believe that this island could represent a threat to the security of the United States? Furthermore, an unusual and extraordinary threat to the security of the United States. That is a lie and a complete fallacy.
What the Americans are saying is that you allowed Chinese and Russian surveillance bases, that they saw this through satellite images, that the island, isn't that true?
That's why I'm telling you, these are fabrications built on manipulation and lies. Can they show where these bases are?
And the question?
There are no Chinese bases in Cuba. We've said that several times already. We've already stated that. What happens is that the mainstream media and the entire social media algorithm are usually subordinated to the interests of the American public.
Look at these images.
Therefore, they end up imposing these narratives and these worldviews. And it's really quite difficult for voices from the global south and the voices of developing countries, and in particular, especially the voice of a small country like Cuba, need to be heard and taken into consideration. But I say, let's go back to our history. At what exact moment in our history did Cuba take any kind of aggressive or hostile action against the United States? The true nature of Cubans is one of friendship and total cooperation. We are not a problem. We do not want to attack the United States. We want to live in peace. We have many things to do for the development of our country, and to achieve the prosperity that the Cuban people deserve because of their heroic nature. What was Cuba's sin? Just trying to build socialism only 90 miles from the United States. Well, that was our decision. That was what our people decided for the most part. We are not telling them to go and change their political system, much less thinking about attacking the United States to make them change their political system. So you asked me about dialogue. I believe there are possibilities for dialogue, but it's difficult. Why are there possibilities? Well, historically, Cuba has been in favor of this since the triumph of the revolution led by Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro and also under the continued leadership of Army General Raúl Castro. And this is the firm position of the younger generations who have now taken on the leadership of the main tasks of our revolution. We intend to establish dialogue and engage in dialogue with the United States so that we can resolve our bilateral issues through dialogue, and to find various areas of cooperation to build trust and move away from confrontation, but this needs to be without any preconditions. It needs to be based on respect for our sovereignty and our system, our political system. It needs to be dialogue in contexts where the principle of reciprocity applies and where the right to internationality is respected. We have firmly maintained this position and have reiterated it several times regarding the United States. We have already expressed this position publicly. Why is that? Why does it become so difficult? In the history of Cuba and the United States, I'm not going to tell you the whole story. But in the history of Cuba and the United States, there has always been an aggressive stance from the United States and a small island that was attacked, Cuba. On the other hand, the attempts at dialogue and the possibilities for dialogue are different. They are not exclusive to this moment. In several other administrations and in other times in the past, they tried to use dialogue to deceive or create channels for dialogue. They were indeed established. But when we established the possibility of dialogue, unfortunately, we were not able to make significant progress. Because there has always been this deeply ultra-conservative mindset in some sectors of the United States, and they ended up sabotaging these attempts at dialogue and these important conversations. Furthermore, when we had frank dialogue, when we achieved certain accomplishments, I can say with full responsibility that Cuba has fulfilled and maintained all of its agreements. And the United States did not really fulfill its part of the agreement. Another element that makes this dialogue and these negotiations more difficult to achieve results that are fruitful for both countries is directly related to the current stance of the United States administration. There is distrust in saying that there is dialogue, and there is distrust among the Cuban population about how this dialogue can move forward because supposedly we have it on one side. He said that both sides, both the Venezuelan government and the American government, ended up deceiving each other in the dialogue. And in the midst of all this, there was an unexpected and violent attack, and they assassinated the president. They also said that there was a process of diplomatic dialogue between the government of Israel and the government of Iran amid tensions, and right in the middle of the dialogue, the United States attacked the Islamic Republic of Iran. So they have this suspicion that we are trying to move forward with this dialogue, and constantly the US official representatives and people from the State Department are saying that Cuba is a failed state. That we are incompetent, that we do not accept humanitarian aid, and that we have Chinese and Russian military bases on our territory, Cuba, that we represent an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. And they are constantly using the rhetoric of war and confrontation and threats against Cuba. So it's very difficult in a situation like this to do that, because to achieve this dialogue, which is what we hope for, there has to be some willingness from both sides to find common ground so that we can move forward.
One of the things the Americans are saying is that they really want your system to change, to open up. Thank you, Mr. President. In Havana in the past few days, I saw the impact of the blockade on your country, the fuel shortage, the hospitals that are facing difficulties. We saw piles of garbage all over the city. It has been incredibly difficult to see how intense the suffering of the people here has been. I understand that you are going to say that most of this is because of the blockade. But the people I've been talking to also say that it's not entirely Washington's fault, that it's also your fault. What responsibility do you take for the great suffering of your people?
We have always fully acknowledged the mistakes and failures we have made. And the revolution has been consistently and rigorously self-critical, and as part of this criticism shared with the people, we have overcome problems. What is happening is that we are going through a very exceptional situation. We have been under blockade for 60 years. This is the longest blockade in the history of humanity. And it's not just a regular blockade, it's an economic, financial, commercial, and currently also an energy blockade. And this blockade is not being imposed by just any country. This is being imposed by the most powerful nation in the world, the nation that holds control over the use of hard currency and global finances. So, global interest in energy? The cruelest and most perverse aspect of this blockade is the long and exhausting period of time that has already passed. This is the greatest offense committed against Cuba and the Cuban people who have endured all these hardships for decades. And now, unfortunately, we are feeling and suffering from this ourselves here in Argentina as well. A titanic blockade in a world that stands against the blockade. This is a strategic narrative created by the United States government to try to make the real culprit behind the situation Cuba faces today completely invisible. That's the economic and commercial blockade, right? Then they blame the government of Cuba itself. Cuba is definitely not a failed state.
Cuba is not a state of faith.
The ones who failed were the Cuban people themselves.
It's not just because of the blockade.
M explains, we take responsibility for what we have, for what we need to improve, for what we need to get better at, the things we couldn't achieve, and the things we've had to postpone because of the blockade. But even if we had done everything perfectly, the country would still be in the situation it's in, simply because the main cause of this is the blockade. And let me tell you something. The fact that we have 20 hours or more of power outages is not because of the incapacity of our national power grid. Our engineers and our system specialists are capable, so you understand me. The power plant, its longtime team, is working with National Oil, which is heavy oil, thanks to their talent and expertise. And the plants are not able to be repaired or go through the normal maintenance process. They keep in their system rest cycles, constant blockages in the units until they are full of sludge. By creating money, let me finish this idea. This economic blockade prevents large amounts of currency from being sent directly to Cuba. The blockade prevents Cuba from being able to claim credits or shares from the Union, statistics that come to the island, or about the fuel resources that arrive in Cuba. After all, can any country function without fuel? What about the United States? If they don't have access to fuel, even in the United States, despite having oil reserves to maintain their consumption levels. They invaded other countries to be able to get fuel and oil from other countries. And in Cuba it's different. They don't allow us to get fuel, unlike any failed state. And in the midst of this situation, this country overcame COVID using Cuban vaccines based on Cuba's scientific development. There is no failed state like the one we have in Cuba. There is no failed state like the one we have in Cuba. We have better indicators in the fight against COVID-19, better even than those of the United States. Scientific potential, and this is only possible because our system guarantees within its limitations a universal health system and a universal education system, in addition to culture and sports as rights of our people, and we do this free of charge and we allow it.
And Cuban doctors are known all over the world. Cuban doctors are known and respected all over the world. There's no doubt about that, but you trade with the Chinese, you trade with some European countries. Why not take it a step further and adopt the model of China or Vietnam, where they opened their markets and accepted that the rigid communist system didn't work?
We managed to do all those things, but the main party responsible for the problems we face now is the United States, for example. There are more than 67,000 newborns in Cuba who need some special medications, and they face a limitation regarding the medicines and drugs needed to keep them alive. And Cuba is unable to provide this medical care. We are limited because of the Cuban system or the Cuban government or because of the blockade. Our infant mortality rate was 4 per thousand live births a few years ago, and now that rate is 9.2 per thousand live births. Does it have to be this way? This is related to the worsening of the blockade.
We have about 34,000 mothers and pregnant women today who are in a situation of vulnerability and risk and need special care, which we are not able to fully provide as a result of the impact of the blockade. In addition, we currently have more than 1,000 cancer patients.
This includes 12,000 children who need cancer treatment, 16,000 patients who require radiotherapy, and another 16,000 people who depend on dialysis. Unfortunately, today we do not have enough resources. This is a direct result of the impact of the blockade. They talk about China and Vietnam. We study the experiences of China and Vietnam and maintain constant theoretical exchanges with them. But they were not under a 60-year blockade like Cuba. Their blockades were shorter, and after that they were granted most favored nation status by the United States. And that has not been the position of the United States towards Cuba. We were harassed, and as part of that harassment by the United States, we managed to overcome the blockade, and I believe what failed was the policy of the United States. Using this policy of maximum pressure, which was duly acknowledged by the president, and they themselves confirmed that they used maximum pressure, that's why it's necessary. There's nothing else they can do against us except obliterate us. So, what really failed was that they simply couldn't crush us. And we are part of our people, and we try to build everything with the participation of the people, and we acknowledge that we have made mistakes. For example, we were waiting for a better moment to introduce a series of measures that could improve the economy. We were waiting, and I saw the 200 reforms. But even so, even with the adoption of these measures, it will be difficult to implement them because of the blockade, because there will be no more fuel available. Precisely because we are applying these measures as long as there is a blockade, these measures will be limited. If we are so incapable, why? Why did you put it into practice? They don't lift the blockade, remove the blockade, and let's see how things unfold. If we are so incapable, if we are so incompetent, if we are so unable to develop our country, then don't block us anymore. Why are you blocking me? Let me handle the criticism on my own and see if I can make it or if I follow my own path. I'm sure we will succeed, even with this blockade. Well,
the criticism, Mr. President, is that the Cuban economy is centralized, highly unproductive, with a vast public sector. You did not allow the private sector to prosper or even for a private sector to exist, except now with a small opening, strong dependence on oil imports, and of course the tourism industry, which you depended on, was decimated. So in part, it's the system you adopted for decades, long before this last blockade in January.
Is it your opinion that the system is responsible for all of this? I'll explain why. From my point of view, I don't agree with that position because many lies are being told and because the reality of the country is being ignored. When, in the last 10 years, the country has been introducing a series of updates to its social and economic model. For example, more than 80% of the land in Cuba belongs to private actors in the economy. And yet, agriculture has not been able to progress satisfactorily, and we have not managed to achieve fully sustainable agriculture or attain food sovereignty. All of this is because of the direct impact of the blockade on our agriculture. Currently, more than 80% of agricultural production is being carried out by non-state actors. The Secretary of State doesn't have that number, right? Or the President doesn't know? Let's discuss tourism. We used to receive 4 million tourists a few years ago, and the tourism industry was one of the main industries in the country. When we had that revenue, we were able to maintain a certain level of maintenance at the power plants. We didn't have these power outages like we do today. We had a stable foreign exchange market. We had a constant supply of food for our population and a regular supply of raw materials for our production, and we were able to do some exporting. During President Trump's first term, he implemented 247 measures tightening the blockade and put us on a list of countries that supposedly sponsor terrorism. This cut off all forms of support. And using Title 10, or rather Title 3 of the Helms-Burton Act, they stopped American tourists from coming. However, you are not allowed to come to Cuba as tourists. In addition, they have ESTA in Europe, which is the system that allows European citizens to come to the US, using very simple visa procedures. And then the US government said that if someone came to Cuba as a tourist, they would become ineligible for the ESTA tourist visa to the US. And that cut off the flow of tourists from Europe to Cuba. When they enforced the fuel measures and the executive order, the airlines that would bring tourists stopped coming here because there is no fuel here. So the problem is in the sector of the Cuban economy, the one that used to receive 4 million tourists annually. And the hotels are in fact very good, and it's a very pleasant tourist destination.
And I want to show you what Zine Inebo says. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said this. He accused the security apparatus linked to your government, GAISA, of corruption and mismanagement. There are estimates suggesting that between 40 and 70% of the entire country's economy is under the control of this apparatus. And this is taken advantage of by the elites and not by the ordinary Cuban people. That's why we're seeing blackouts, that's why we're seeing shortages, that's why we're seeing hunger. Do you admit there's corruption and mismanagement that led to this?
He has no knowledge about the circumstances in which GAISA was created or about how the Cuban business community is structured. GAISA was created in the early years of the special period when we were going through very difficult times, quite comparable to now. The socialist bloc disappeared completely and our most important allies were gone. Cuba lost more than 75% of all its key markets for international trade. And we lost about 13 million tons of oil that we used to receive regularly to compensate for our exports of other products to the socialist bloc, mainly sugar. So those were very difficult and challenging conditions. At that time, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba, so that they would not become a heavy burden on the country's economy, developed a business model. And they developed a series of industries, and they are not part of GAISA. They developed construction companies, industrial companies, scientific centers, and they also developed the GAISA conglomerate, which plays a very significant role in strategic investments aimed at tourism. With the development of this business system, which is certainly not the only one in the country, the armed forces managed to guarantee their full financial self-sufficiency and no longer depend on the national economy, so that the resources of the national economy could be used to meet the fundamental needs of the civilian population. And they also contributed actively. And they continue to contribute part of their production to the national economy and to the well-being of the population, in addition to supplying all the internal needs of the armed forces themselves. In addition, most of this revenue collected was sent to the state treasury, and the government used it to finance and develop several important projects. When those more than 240 measures were implemented and we were designated as a supposed state sponsor of terrorism, and then we had COVID and had to deal with COVID, we started facing shortages of medicine, hard currency. Tourism was declining because of the blockade policy. We were having difficulties with transportation and medicine. We used these funds to survive during those years, and with these funds we were able to buy medicine and raw materials so that our pharmaceutical industry could produce medicine. We used those funds to buy food, to provide the delivery of a basic food basket at subsidized prices for all citizens of the country. They also made a significant contribution to the country's energy transition, and those funds were used for food production for our population. First of all, there is a complete lack of knowledge about how this business system was established and the important contribution they made to the Cuban economy. And they are not the only ones participating in the Cuban economy. Currently, in the Cuban economy, there is the state business system, GAISA, and there is a significant movement of private entrepreneurs. Currently, there are more than 16,000 private sector actors in Cuba, And there is a very significant number of entrepreneurs working individually. Are they supporting the population now? That's not mentioned. Do they ignore it? They don't even talk about it. And they don't talk about the relationship between the state sector and the private sector in the Cuban economy. In Cuba, the levels of corruption.
But are they supporting the Cuban economy now? Because I'm talking to people who say their monthly salary is like $14 a month or $20 a month. You know, when you talk about the Cuban economy, it's collapsing.
As part of this tightening of the blockade, a part of the economy became paralyzed. The state economy is more paralyzed than the private sector, because even when the private sector is suffering the effects and the impact of the blockade, they have different ways to overcome these impacts. But those Cubans who live in Cuba, whether they are from the private or state sector, are working for the Cuban people. We have inflation. There is an imbalance in terms of purchasing power and wages because we are going through a crisis. We are being condemned to an economic crisis. They are trying to suffocate us and strangle our economy. And through this economic strangulation, they are trying to create social imbalance.
You acknowledge that it's not just the blockade. You admitted that to your party. You mentioned that there are internal factors that are not directly related to the blockade.
What examples do you have? Thank you. But the big truth is that you, in a completely unexpected and genuine way, ended up surprising me so much that I don't even know exactly what to say now, because I really didn't expect something like this to happen right at this exact moment in our conversation. Those mistakes that we recognize and overcome at other times in our lives and that allow us to achieve social accomplishments that the United States does not have. The high degree of participation, the level of health services, the level of education, including higher education that we have, as well as the level of equality that we have managed to achieve. What happens is that this US policy is criminal. We are talking about a genocidal policy. We are talking about a strategic precept that was first presented in 1960 by official memorandum, a memorandum known as the Lester-Mallory Memorandum.
But don't you think that...
Maybe that was the formula for Cuba?
Don't you think that for decades the policies you implemented brought your Cuba?
Not receiving exports, so that the situation with wages and shortages leads to a social uprising.
So you don't take responsibility for the policies that have existed in this country for decades, and that made it vulnerable. So when there's this kind of blockade, these sanctions are imposed. You have a system that really didn't allow your market to open up.
I don't think our policies are vulnerable. Our policies haven't been vulnerable. Our policies haven't been vulnerable. Our policies have been successful because if we manage to survive the blockade, it's because our policies are effective. What happens is that, why do they tell us that the market should be the goal? Who says that the market will actually guarantee equality and social justice? We have a market, and we also need to observe the rules of the market because we don't let the market control the situation. We try to help the most vulnerable, right? Especially those with greater difficulties and also the retirees, and we don't always manage to achieve everything we intended with this social policy. With our social policies as a result of the limitations of the blockade, because in order to have social justice and develop social programs, you need to have an economy that supports it. For example, in Cuba, all children go to school regardless of their background, what they believe, or the color of their skin. And they use and have access to an extremely robust and free educational system that is recognized worldwide, while the islanders there simply don't have anything similar. In Cuba, every citizen has the guaranteed right to enter university, to obtain an undergraduate degree, pursue a master's, and even complete a doctorate, without having to pay absolutely anything for this education, regardless of their social background or their family's financial situation and resources. In Cuba, you can enjoy culture, you can enjoy sports. Are these achievements and impressive results the result of a failed social policy? Or is it that this social policy, which is not based on market logic but rather on solidarity, social justice, equality and inclusion, is the policy that is causing discomfort because it shows that another world is possible? And this is the model that many people around the world are defending, for whom Cuba is a source of hope and an example to follow.
Mr. President, I would like to ask you about some reports that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have made. They said that dissent in Cuba is met with harassment, criminalization, violence, house arrest, and torture. Marco Rubio highlighted this point and says that you repress anyone who dares to complain. I would just like to ask you about the several hundred political prisoners and activist journalists who still remain in prison due to the protests that took place a few years ago. Some people who put up banners were arrested. I want to ask you about some of these specific cases and the concerns about human rights in this country. So, for example, I want to ask about Leonardo Richard Gonzalez Alfonso. He is in prison. He is serving a 7-year sentence for hanging up a poster in the city. Why is he in prison?
Usually the references you bring are quite impressive. I mean, what Marco Rubio says, what Trump said, what Amnesty International said, I would kindly ask you to look for other references as well. And you are in Cuba and can find other points of view. That is also something that has been heavily manipulated. And there is an entire media narrative constructed against our own revolution to try to delegitimize and discredit the world revolution. In Cuba, there simply are no political prisoners. In Cuba, the citizens who are currently serving prison sentences are not serving these sentences simply because they are for or against the revolution, but rather due to the fact that they have actually committed various crimes and offenses that are duly provided for in our penal code as well as in our civil code. Regarding the protests, there are several people who were financed and supported by the United States. And in this case, the desire to protest against the revolution, right? They didn't just protest against the revolution, which many people do every day. Both on social media and in our daily lives, there are people who are against the revolution, just as there are people who are in favor of the revolution who are also bothered and dissatisfied, and they are not in prison. So some people, using this as a simple excuse, end up committing acts of vandalism. And those who commit vandalism against the country's security, disturbing internal order, are indicted and tried with due process of law, as would happen anywhere else in the world, including in the United States. Why? Because there is repression and police brutality and very poor treatment of black people. That is something from American society, not from Cuban society. For example, July 11th, which is one of the events most subject to manipulation. The July 11th protest was part of a very difficult situation. We started to suffer some of the limitations due to the tightening of the blockade with the pressures and measures implemented by Trump, which Biden kept, and the pandemic. Very long power outages, lack of medicine. When our oxygen plant broke down, the United States government prevented other companies from selling us oxygen, and we had to do a lot of things to keep people from dying. We had no way to access vaccines, and we had to develop our own vaccines. Against that whole backdrop, we had the protest on July 11th, a protest where there were thousands of people. There weren't about 35,000 people in prison. In the end, 700 people were subjected to legal proceedings, and many of them did not go to trial because some were very young and received different treatment. Working directly and closely with the families involved, with the educational institutions, and all those individuals who committed acts of vandalism, theft, violations, and public disorder against our security forces have been duly charged, as they would be anywhere else in the world. Many of them in various pardons we have granted recently, not just specifically for these people, but general pardons that were given to some inmates. Many of them ended up being released well before serving their full sentences. In particular, I don't feel in a position to discuss specific cases at this moment. In Cuba, I can say no one is imprisoned because their ideas are contrary to the revolution, because we are fully aware that not everyone in the population supports the revolution. But we do not allow anyone in the country, those groups and bases that are against the revolution, to commit acts of vandalism and disorder, because there is a very strict and established security, and we are not willing to let absolutely anyone break it in any way. In a large part of these specific cases, those people who deliberately commit acts of vandalism are later shown to have been paid and financed by agents of the federal government of the United States of America.
I know you want to, but I was told to hurry up.
And another thing is, if they believe there is torture, show me who was tortured. I challenge them to present evidence of any citizen who has been tortured or tried just because they protested and not because they committed acts of vandalism.
Many reports about Zestemosewa and his allies.
Ask how many people in the United States have been unjustly.
And Amnesty issues many reports about America and the...
Give me an example, a recent example. Where is the legal evidence of the executions carried out by the United States in the Caribbean Sea, supposedly because they are drug traffickers? Where is the evidence about those people who died? So, are they drug traffickers?
Amnesty produces a lot of reports about this, which I was trying to address.
The world is condemning this, and the world is demanding answers about it. Who will take responsibility for all the Palestinians who were killed in the Gaza Strip, or for the children who were killed when an Iranian school was bombed? We also have many questions to ask the United States government. This government that is building this narrative suggesting that we are dictators and oppressors, we are not that kind of people. I can tell you that with complete honesty.
We've already been talking for almost an hour, and I just wanted to ask you, where do you think this will lead for you and your country? How do you think this is going to end?
We have established a whole comprehensive process for improving and developing our society. Regardless of all the various elements and factors we discussed in the first questions about how we are preparing to defend ourselves, which is not in any way an aggressive concept, but rather purely defensive, and specifically to avoid direct confrontation. We really have a solid and well-structured economic strategy to continue our socialist construction in this extremely adverse and challenging situation, which is the longest blockade in all of modern history, imposed by the most powerful imperialist power in history. And now, with this additional fuel blockade, we have a clear political perspective. To strengthen the participation of the people in the main decision-making processes, and so that the people can have access to more elements when making decisions. And also in public oversight, in strengthening these things so that everything is transparent. We are working very hard at the community level and in involving people within the community. We are giving young people a major role in our society. And furthermore, it's important to note that this process repeats itself over and over, with no defined end for everyone involved in this situation. The hard currency was deregulated because people were distinguished not by their contribution and their work, but rather by their ability to have foreign currency or not. So, a certain element of the free market introduced a social inequality. That's why we seek to respond to this with comprehensive social policies aimed at redistributing wealth to those most in need and to those who are most vulnerable. We are aware that to do this, we need to ensure the unity of our people. And I always say that unity is achieved and strengthened through greater participation by promoting all kinds of debates and creating many spaces for participation. We also have the challenge of maintaining a constant ideological continuity of the revolution. And it is exactly for this reason that we rely on the leadership and participation of young people and the youth. Throughout the process of our revolution, we also have the great challenge of facing this criminal, cruel, and extremely tight blockade against our people's revolution. and we know that we have to do this on our own. We have to be able to overcome the challenges and limitations caused by the blockade based on our own efforts, our own talent, and our own creativity. And the Cuban people are very creative, and one of the fundamental pillars that we have strongly defended is science and technological innovation. Because we have great innovative capacity, and it is an essential part of scientific development throughout our country. In addition, we also have to constantly deal with a huge and aggressive media campaign that tries to poison public opinion. Absolutely everything about Cuba and everything surrounding the Cuban Revolution. And yes, we have shortages in terms of food, transportation, medicine, and energy. We have these shortages, but there is no power outage that can extinguish hope in Cuba. There is no shortage that can destroy the determination of the Cubans. The determination of the Cuban people in the midst of so many difficult situations, the Cuban people managed to organize themselves socially and in their communities, using this solidarity among all our Cuban compatriots and remain united, and under these conditions daily without any kind of transportation. Our doctors and nurses walk long distances to their workplaces to save human lives. Given the lack of electricity and the shortage of fuel, this represents a significant part of our organizations and productive companies. And when I say companies, I mean that both state-owned and private companies are doing everything possible to ensure production that provides essential services and consumer goods for our people, and also to promote exports so that we can improve conditions in terms of purchasing power, wage levels, and price stability. This is exactly who we are. People who decided never to surrender nor to give in, who suffered a lot and received collective punishment without any justification. So with all these aspects which were not built overnight, this did not arise from centralized leadership, but rather as an essential part of the broad and diverse popular debate that we have actively maintained over the past 10 years. We have constantly reviewed and updated our policies, concepts, and proposals, incorporating all the valuable contributions brought by these discussions and by what I have called creative resistance. This process is not just the act of resisting, but a movement of resistance, growing stronger and overcoming every adversity we encounter along the way. I am sure that although the country's future will be difficult and the road will be long, it will be one of prosperity and victory.